Garrett, let's start with you at the White House, because they're leaning into the politics of this case, trying to paint a contrast with Democrats on immigration, when this is really now a question of due process. Court of public opinion, though, is far from the same as the court of law.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Allie. And the White House is all in on the political side of it. On the legal side of it, their argument's pretty narrow. They say they are doing their best to comply. They understand what the court's order is. But, shucks, this man, Abrego Garcia, is in El Salvador now. He's out of our jurisdiction. You heard there from the president of El Salvador saying he's staying. There's nothing we can do. Politically speaking, they are telling the courts and their critics essentially to pound sand, that they believe the president is on firm political footing here. His immigration and deportation policies are broadly popular in the polling. They're the areas in which he actually polls the strongest, according to CNBC's most recent polling across these different issue sets. And they're going to stand firm and argue that they are trying to keep the public safe. That was the message that Tom Homan gave on this network this morning.
I think we removed the bad guy from this country who was down at home in the custody of his country. And this country has to make the decision to release him. We think we made the right steps, and we took a bad guy and removed him from the United States, and now he's home.
Allie, whether Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a good guy or a bad guy is obviously secondary to the legal argument, but the White House wants to win the broader public political argument and essentially dare the courts to enforce their order somehow, some way. That's where things stand here today.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen them ramping up on that front, Garrett. But, Chuck, on this battle between the White House and the courts, the appeals court judge in the Abrego Garcia case yesterday said, quote, "We yet cling to the hope that it is not naive to believe our good brethren in the executive branch perceive the rule of law as vital to the American ethos." Effectively, you guys believe in the courts and the law, right? But all signs point to the high court once again here. So how do you think that the Supreme Court will handle this if and when they get it again?
Yeah, and Allie, I naively perhaps cling to that same hope. We are a nation of laws. Rule of law is embedded in our culture and in our society, and ignoring it is at all of our peril. And if I could just touch on something Garrett said, it doesn't matter if this gentleman is a good guy, a bad guy, or the worst guy ever. The notion is that we afford due process to people, and we adjudicate in a court before a judge, right, whether or not we've met the burden of proving that they did what we allege them to do. And if he's the worst guy ever, we should all want as Americans that he get that same due process. What does the Supreme Court do with this? I don't know that they necessarily take it. It seems plausible to me, although not definite, that the last word may have come from the Fourth Circuit, the very opinion you just cited. They were quite clear on what this individual is entitled to receive, and he ought to receive it in a court of law in the United States. And if it turns out that he is the worst guy ever and or deportable or should be imprisoned because he committed a crime, so be it. This is not about him per se. It is about adhering to our processes, and due process is embedded in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. We ought to adhere to it.
Yeah, this is yet about the larger principle, as you point out. But, Chuck, is there any precedent for what the Justice Department should be doing in this case?
Well, Allie, it's a good question. So let me answer that at a high level. There is some precedent. When I was a federal prosecutor, I had on my desk a quotation from a Supreme Court case, Berger v. United States, decided in 1935, which made plain in an eloquent passage from Justice Sutherland that the obligation of a United States attorney, or in this case, the Justice Department, is not simply to win, but to do justice. That we, in effect, win if justice is done. And so that is the obligation of the Department of Justice all the time, always, in civil cases and in immigration cases and in criminal cases. We are not an ordinary party to litigation. We are different. And as a representative of the sovereign, the Department of Justice has to ensure that justice is done. That may sound quaint or antiquated, but it's something that I firmly believe in.
And should be foundational here. But turning back to the politics, Tyler, Democrats are seemingly divided on how much attention they should give to this case when separately and simultaneously you've got the Trump tariffs hitting the economy, consumers nervous, the market's skittish. But that's falling out of the headlines somewhat, in large part because of the focus on this. What's the right move here, if there is one, for Democrats?
Yeah, I think Democratic leaders are trying to figure that out. And we're seeing, as with both parties, in all cases, there's a divide of exactly how to handle this issue and talk about it. I think there is some scar tissue within the Democratic Party on the issue of immigration, feeling that Democrats have often been on their back foot when it comes to explaining their work on the border and more broadly their position on immigration. The Democratic Party has a much more diverse set of views on immigration than the Republican Party does for the most part. And so that leads to some of these divisions over how to discuss and talk about these issues. And Democrats have felt that they have been playing defense on the issue for quite some time. And that has led to Republican gains, particularly as it relates to communities of color and Latino voters in the South and in the Southwest. I think one of the things that Democrats are trying to make clear is that this is, bigger than an individual man, as Chuck and Garrett have said. This is about due process and the court of law. But it has been a challenge for some Democrats to fully explain that to the American people because it is complicated and most Americans are not familiar with legalese. But we have seen the Trump administration put a full court press on the politics of this situation, trying to draw a clear contrast between their focus on protecting the border and Democrats' insistence on trying to free this one man. And I think that's one of the challenges that Democrats face is messaging against the Trump administration on what is a nuanced issue that the Trump administration has largely stripped it of that nuance.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Trump administration or the Trump campaigns before it have always done well at basic, broad branding, while Democrats are trying to, on nuanced issues like these, thread that needle. And they worry, especially critics of Democrats, including other Democrats, worry they've missed the forest from the trees on this and other issues. But, Kim, let's talk about a separate case that's also happening right now. Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia student now being held at a Louisiana detention facility, says the Trump administration is targeting him because of his pro-Palestinian activism. They've also said that. Unlike Abrego Garcia, he is a legal permanent resident and is still facing deportation. But he wrote an op-ed today where I thought he distilled this moment so clearly as it applies to both his case, but also the other cases going through right now, which is just the simple question of who has the right to have rights.
Yes, and I think in this way, and to also address the previous question about how we talk about this, Democrats, Americans, this case, as well as the Khalil, as well as the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, this isn't about immigration policy. Democrats can say we need secure borders, but we need a better system of dealing with the immigration crisis that is happening in the United States. But these two men were detained and or deported in a way that clearly violates the letter and the principle of our Constitution. If they want to find a way to really encapsulate what's happening, they can use the opinion that Judge Wilkinson of the Fourth Circuit handed down, because what he said is this man dangerous? Perhaps, perhaps not. But what we do know is he was protected by an order keeping him from being shipped to El Salvador. And we can add to that, I can say, in this case, we do know that someone was detained and whisked off, disappeared because of his speech, which violates the very heart of the First Amendment. And that is what we don't do in America. If we do not draw a line here, then nothing stops this administration from going after American citizens, which the president already says he wants to do. He wants to go after journalists like me. He wants to go after other people and deport them if they're American citizens. I take him seriously and literally at that. And what Judge Wilkinson said, if we have a democracy, if we adhere, if we rise to the principles that the framers set out in our Constitution, we must, on no uncertain terms, stand against that. The courts need to understand their power. Yes, the administration has broad power on immigration and foreign policy, but the courts have power too, and that is to adhere to the Constitution and say you can't do what you want to do, administration, by any means. You have to follow the law.
Watching this battle play out in real time, we will continue, of course, following every turn of it. But for now, Garrett Haake, Tyler Pager, Chuck Rosenberg, and Kimberly Atkins Stohr, thank you all for joining us.